Oh, please. Did someone give you that as charity? Granville's voice cut across the restaurant. He was staring at the old gold ring on my finger. My daughter Nora went completely still. I looked down at it. The ring was scratched. Its gold had dulled with age, but I'd worn it every day since my wife, Elise, died. Graham leaned back and laughed. That thing is practically falling apart. A couple at the next table glanced over. Nora lowered her voice. Graham, that's enough. He smiled. What? I'm just saying. Some things are meant to be replaced. I wrapped my fingers around the ring. He had no idea what it had survived. He had no idea what it was worth. And he certainly didn't know why I would never replace it. I was about to answer when a chair suddenly scraped across the floor behind us. A woman from table 4 had stood up. She wasn't looking at Graham. She was looking at me. Her face had gone pale. She walked toward our table slowly, as if she wasn't sure whether she was seeing a memory or a man. Then she stopped. Her eyes moved from my face to the ring, and she whispered a name nobody at that table had ever heard. Jonathan? My entire body went still. Nora stared at me. Graham's smile disappeared. The woman stepped closer. You still have it. My throat tightened. How do you know that name? She looked at me for several seconds. Then her voice dropped. Your wife asked me to find you. Elise. Hearing my late wife's name from a stranger made the room feel suddenly cold. Nora leaned toward me. Dad, who is she? I didn't know how to answer, because I had spent decades making sure nobody connected Jonathan to the man sitting at that restaurant table. And now, in less than a minute, a stranger had done exactly that. Before we continue, subscribe and join our growing family for emotional stories of family, betrayal, justice, and unforgettable life lessons. And tell me in the comments where you're watching from. I always love seeing how far these stories travel. My daughter thought this woman had simply mistaken me for someone else. She didn't know that Jonathan belonged to a life I'd buried long before she was born, and that the ring Graham had just called worthless was the reason that life had found me again. My name is Silas Beaumont. I'm 72 years old, a widower, and for most of my life, I thought I had buried the man I used to be along with my past. But before I tell you why that woman called me Jonathan, you need to understand who I was before anyone knew my name. Before that dinner, before Graham's insult, before the woman at table 4 spoke the name Jonathan, there was a time when Elise and I had almost nothing. We lived in a cramped apartment above a hardware store. The kitchen was barely big enough for 2 people, so we'd sit across from each other at a tiny table with 2 plates between us. I worked late. Elise waited. More than once, I'd come home to find my coffee sitting beside her, completely cold. She'd smile anyway. You're home. That was Elise. When I finally secured our first business loan, we celebrated with a cheap bottle of wine and takeout. When our company made its first real profit, Elise didn't buy jewelry. She bought better equipment. That will make the next year easier, she said. She was right. Eventually, we moved into a house of our own. The night we carried our last boxes through the front door, Elise stood in the empty living room and laughed. We actually did it. I looked at her hand. She was wearing the ring I'd bought years earlier. It wasn't expensive then. I had chosen it because I could afford it, not because it was beautiful. She had loved it anyway. As our business grew, the ring became far more valuable. Experts eventually estimated it at around $20,000. Elise never cared. Neither did I. After she died, I kept wearing it. Every morning, I'd fasten my watch, button my shirt, and feel that ring against my finger. Taking it off felt wrong, like admitting that part of my life was over. Nora knew the ring belonged to her mother. She knew our family had worked hard, but she never knew how large the business eventually became. I deliberately kept that world away from her. Elise understood why. Whenever I suggested replacing the old ring with something newer, she'd smile and say, "Some things become more valuable because you remember what they survived." I always thought she meant our marriage. After that woman called me Jonathan, I wasn't so sure, because Elise had known parts of my past that even my daughter had never heard. And suddenly, the ring didn't feel like a memory anymore. It felt like a clue. I thought the ring was simply the last piece of our old life I refused to let go of. Years later, I began wondering whether Elise had always known it would lead someone back to me. I didn't dislike Graham when Nora first brought him home. In fact, I wanted to like him. He was confident, well-spoken, and ambitious. He shook my hand firmly and talked about building something of his own. "I don't want to live off anybody," he told me. I respected that. A few months later, Graham approached me privately with a business proposal. He wanted an investment. I read every page. The numbers looked impressive until I started checking what sat underneath them. Several achievements he claimed as his own had actually been completed by employees. His projections assumed growth that had no evidence behind it, and one former employee had left after Graham repeatedly took credit for her work. I asked him about it. He brushed everything aside. "That's business." "No," I told him, "that's your reputation." He stared at me. I closed the proposal. "I won't invest." His face changed. "You don't believe in me?" "I believe you can do better." He didn't hear the second sentence. He only heard the first. After that, something shifted. Graham began telling Nora that I thought he was incapable. Then incapable became arrogant. Arrogant became unworthy. And eventually, Nora started defending him against things I had never actually said. One evening she called me. "Dad, Graham thinks you don't respect him." "I've never said that. He feels it." I could have confronted Graham. Instead, I told Nora, "I don't want you caught between us." That was my mistake. Because silence left room for Graham to fill in the blanks. He began telling her, "Your father will never see me as good enough." I watched my daughter slowly start believing him. The man who had once wanted my approval now seemed determined to prove he didn't need it. But I knew something else. He wasn't angry because I had refused his money. He was angry because I had seen the weaknesses behind the image he worked so hard to maintain. And Graham had no intention of letting me forget that refusal. Graham didn't hate me because I refused to give him money. He hated me because my refusal forced him to face something about himself he wasn't ready to admit. After the restaurant incident, I stopped wondering whether Graham's arrogance was harmless. I started looking at his professional life. The first report made my jaw tighten. He had taken credit for work completed by junior employees. Then there were expense reports that didn't quite add up. A former colleague had complained about pressure to hide mistakes. Another employee had transferred departments after Graham repeatedly humiliated him in front of others. None of it was enough by itself. Together, it formed a pattern. Then I noticed something I hadn't expected. The company Graham worked for kept appearing in records from a very different chapter of my life. I made one phone call. An old executive answered. There was silence when he heard my voice. Then, "Is that really you?" "Yes." He laughed softly. "I haven't heard that voice in years." "Keep it that way." He understood. "Does Graham know?" "No." "Should we tell him?" "Absolutely not." A few days later, I visited one of the company's older offices. A former employee recognized me before I reached reception. He shook my hand with both of his. "Sir, it's good to see you." I smiled. "Please don't call me that." He lowered his voice. "People here still remember what you built." I left before anyone could ask more questions. But Graham was already moving into dangerous territory. He had approved a major deal that could expose the company to enormous losses. The proposal looked polished. The numbers looked convincing. But I knew enough to see the weaknesses hidden beneath them. Graham didn't know who had built the company. He didn't know who still had authority over its future. And he certainly didn't know that someone was already watching the decision he had just made. I kept my identity hidden. Not because I was afraid of Graham. Because I wanted to know how far he would go when he believed nobody powerful was watching. For years, Graham had been trying to prove I was an irrelevant old man. He didn't know the company he was gambling with had been built from a decision I made decades earlier. The woman from Table 4 didn't approach me again that night. She simply left the restaurant before I could stop her. The next morning, I found a handwritten note beneath my front door. "Call me, Maribel Crane." There was a number underneath. I called. "Silas?" "Yes." "I wondered if you would." We met that afternoon at a quiet cafe. Up close, Maribel looked familiar, though I couldn't place her. She noticed me staring. You don't remember me? No. You were too busy building your company. That made me smile. Then you knew me before all that? I knew Elise before all that. She told me they had met when we were young, during the years when Elise and I were still struggling to make ends meet. Then Maribel looked at my hand. The ring. What about it? I remember when Elise first showed it to me. She described the tiny apartment, the cheap furniture, the excitement Elise had when she told her friend that I had bought it for her. I hadn't expected that. But then Maribel's expression changed. Your wife contacted me shortly before she died. My smile disappeared. Why didn't she tell me? Maribel looked down at her coffee. Because there were things she knew that she didn't want to explain over the phone. What things? She didn't answer. I leaned forward. Maribel. She finally looked at me. Your wife didn't ask me to find you because of the ring, Silas. My stomach tightened. Then why? She hesitated. Because she was concerned about Graham. I stared at her. Graham? She nodded. What did Elise know? Maribel shook her head. Not yet. Why not? Because some truths are dangerous when they're told before the right person is ready to hear them. That answer frustrated me. But before I could push harder, she stood. Your wife trusted me for a reason. Then she left. I sat there alone, thinking about Elise. Had she seen something in Graham that I had missed? Had she known about his ambition? His resentment? Or something much worse? That evening, I noticed Graham's car parked across from Maribel's apartment. He hadn't seen me. He was watching her building. I understood immediately. Graham was investigating her too. And whatever Maribel knew, he was afraid she might tell me. Until that moment, I thought Graham's hatred had started with my refusal to invest in him. Now I had to wonder whether my wife had seen something about him years before I ever opened my eyes. The next report from my investigators was different from the others. This time, Graham wasn't merely behaving badly. He was about to put my company at serious risk. He had proposed a major acquisition that looked brilliant on paper. The projections promised rapid growth. The board would see a stronger market position. Graham would look like the executive who had delivered the company's next great opportunity. But when I read the numbers, I saw the problem immediately. Expected revenue had been inflated. Several liabilities had been buried deep inside the supporting documents. One major expense had been pushed into a later reporting period. The deal wasn't brilliant. It was dangerous. If Graham's projections failed, the company could lose millions. I sat alone in my study with the report open in front of me. This wasn't just about Graham anymore. This was about the company I had spent decades building. He was gambling with something I had sacrificed half my life to create. I could have stopped him that afternoon. Instead, I called our legal department. Preserve everything. All the acquisition files. Everything. Emails, projections, internal messages, every revision. I wanted the truth documented before Graham could rewrite it. Then Nora called. Her voice sounded uneasy. Dad, can I ask you something? Of course. I found an email on Graham's computer. What kind? He told me the acquisition was completely approved, but this email says there were concerns. I said nothing. Dad? Be careful what you confront him with. She became quiet. Why? Because I don't want him knowing what you know until you're certain. That evening, Nora confronted Graham anyway. I wasn't there. But she later told me what happened. She asked him about the email. He became defensive, then angry. Your father is putting ideas in your head. Nora asked one simple question. Why are you afraid of what my father thinks? Graham had no answer. For the first time, my daughter wasn't defending her husband. She was studying him. And that frightened him more than any accusation could have. If you're enjoying the mystery, take a moment to like the video and subscribe. Because what happens next is where the truth about Graham and the man he has spent years trying to impress finally begins coming together. Graham wasn't simply trying to prove himself anymore. He was about to put my life's work at risk, and my daughter was finally beginning to notice the cracks in the man she had defended. Nora came to my house the following morning. She didn't sit down. She stood in my living room with her arms folded. Dad, Why did those executives know you? I looked at her. She had finally asked the question I'd spent years avoiding. I could have told her everything. Instead, I said, because I knew them before you knew me as your father. She frowned. Who were you? I looked toward the window. There are parts of my life I never wanted you to inherit. That doesn't answer my question. I know. Are you hiding something from me? I took a breath. I've been trying to decide when you should hear it. Nora looked hurt. You're my father. When was I supposed to hear it? Before I could answer, someone knocked. It was Maribel. She held a cream-colored envelope. I recognized the handwriting immediately. My wife's. My hands began to tremble. Maribel placed it in my palm. Elise told me not to give this to you until the right moment. I turned the envelope over. My name was written across the front. I could have opened it. Instead, I placed it on the table. Nora stared at me. You're not going to read it? Not yet. Why? Because once I open it, there are things I may never be able to keep hidden again. Before Nora could respond, my phone rang. It was one of the company's senior executives. Mr. Beaumont, Graham has arrived. My expression changed. Is the board assembled? Yes. Legal? Everyone. I looked at the envelope. Then at Nora. She didn't understand. Not yet. Across town, Graham stepped into the company's executive conference room. He adjusted his jacket. He believed he was walking into a meeting where he could defend the acquisition and secure the promotion he'd wanted for years. He had no idea who was waiting for him. And he had absolutely no idea that the man he had spent years treating like an irrelevant old father-in-law was about to walk through the same door. Graham walked into that meeting expecting to defend his career. He had no idea who would be waiting for him on the other side of those doors. The meeting was already underway when Graham walked in. The room was larger than he expected. Board members sat along one side of the table. Legal counsel had folders open in front of them. Senior executives who had spent years approving his decisions were unusually quiet. Graham stopped. This is about the acquisition? Nobody answered. Then the doors behind him opened. I walked in. Same simple jacket. Same old shoes. And the same ring Graham had mocked in that restaurant. His face drained of color. One of the executives immediately stood. Mr. Beaumont. Another followed. Chairman. Graham looked at me as though he'd never seen me before. Then the truth reached him. The old man he had treated like an embarrassment was the founder of the company. More importantly, I was still its controlling owner. For years, Graham had wanted my approval without even knowing whose approval he was chasing. I took my seat. Let's discuss the acquisition. Graham swallowed. The legal counsel began presenting the evidence. Manipulated projections. Concealed liabilities. Questionable expenses. Employee complaints. Work Graham had claimed as his own. Then the acquisition documents appeared on the screen. Graham tried to explain. I believed the numbers were accurate. The attorney placed another document beside the first. You approved the revised projections yourself. Graham looked at me. I was under pressure. Another file appeared. Then why did you instruct your team to remove this liability from the presentation? He had no answer. One explanation created another contradiction. Eventually, there was nowhere left for him to hide. His position was terminated. His reputation began collapsing almost immediately. Nora had heard enough. She walked toward Graham. You didn't hate my father because he judged you. Her voice trembled. You hated him because you couldn't become the man you wanted him to think you were. She removed her wedding ring. I can't spend another year defending someone who keeps making me ashamed of defending him. Graham looked at me. I said only, the consequences belong to the choices. I didn't smile. I didn't celebrate. Because losing a career was one thing. Losing your daughter's trust was another. But even then, I knew Graham's downfall wasn't the final story. The unopened envelope in my pocket still carried Elise's handwriting. And whatever she had left inside had nothing to do with Graham's career. It was about something much harder for me to face. Graham had finally learned who I was. But the letter sitting unopened in my pocket contained something far more important than my identity, and it was something my wife had kept secret from all of us. I opened Elise's letter that evening. I was alone. For several seconds, I couldn't bring myself to read the first line. Then I saw her handwriting. And suddenly, I was no longer sitting in my study. I was back in that tiny apartment with the cold coffee, the cheap table, and the woman who believed in me before anyone else did. Elise wrote that she had always known I would eventually have to choose between protecting my privacy and telling Nora the truth. She understood why I had hidden my wealth. I never wanted our daughter to measure people by money. I wanted her to know kindness before success, character before status. But Elise also knew my silence had created another problem. Nora didn't know enough about the sacrifices behind the life I'd built. She couldn't understand why I had sometimes remained distant from the business world. She couldn't see what I had given up. Then came the part that stopped me. Elise had noticed Graham's resentment. She had heard enough to become concerned. That's why she contacted Maribel. Not to expose Graham. Not to reveal my wealth. She wanted Maribel to make sure Nora eventually learned the truth from me, not from someone who might use it against her. At the bottom, Elise explained the ring. She remembered those early years. The little apartment. The first loan. The first profit. The nights when we wondered whether we'd make it. The ring had survived all of it. Its $120,000 value meant almost nothing compared with what it represented. Then I reached the final paragraph. Elise wanted me to stop hiding from Nora. Not because she believed secrets were always wrong. Because she believed our daughter deserved to know the man her father had been before the world knew his name. I wiped my eyes. Maribel had been right. Elise hadn't been protecting a secret. She had been protecting the moment when the truth would finally matter. Later, Nora sat beside me. "Dad," she whispered, "will you finally tell me everything?" For the first time, I didn't hesitate. Yes. And that night, I told my daughter everything. My daughter had spent years believing she knew her father. That night she finally discovered the man her mother had loved before the world ever knew his name. Later that evening, Nora took my hand. Her fingers touched the old ring. "Is it really worth $20,000? I smiled. "That's what someone would pay for it." She looked at me. "Then why did you keep wearing something so old?" I thought of Elise. The tiny apartment. The cold coffee. The first loan. The years when we had almost nothing. "Because your mother wore it when we had nothing. I didn't need a better ring after she was gone." Nora's eyes filled. Suddenly, the $112 didn't matter. Neither did Graham's insult. I looked at the ring. Then at my daughter. "You weren't wrong that the ring was old." I paused. "You were wrong to think that anything old was worthless." Nora leaned against my shoulder. For the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was protecting a secret. I was simply sitting beside my daughter, remembering the woman who gave that ring its meaning. If this story meant something to you, subscribe, turn on the bell, and tell me in the comments, would you have stayed silent like Silas or defended yourself in that restaurant?